Thanks for coming. Today's panel is Solving Tomorrow's Spectrum Challenges Today. I got a bunch of great panelist members here to support me. We're kind of a traveling road show. We've done this, I think, 2 times already, and I'm sure this will not be the last time that we try to address the electromagnetic spectrum as it supports commanders across the board, which is what I do as the Defense Spectrum Organization Director. Okay, so I've been in the job for approximately 18 months now, and as she had said, I was at U.S. Forces Command before that in the G6, and then I was at U.S. AFRICOM before that for a number of years doing lots of stuff. So, that's kind of the background of who I am. I'm going to go through real quick, read a couple of things. I think the first slide has to be a disclaimer that I've got to show. Everybody good? Got that? Okay, so during this session, we'll focus on the challenges we are solving and the value we are delivering for our customers and users across DoD. We are operating in a constrained, contested, and congested electromagnetic spectrum environment. And the panelists will discuss the activities against the strategic lines of effort and how they are supporting DoD's efforts to modernize C3 capabilities, to include electromagnetic spectrum C2 capabilities like electromagnetic battle management, to achieve agile electromagnetic spectrum operations, electromagnetic superiority, and joint all-domain command and control. I'll moderate the panel discussion with Brigadier General Lola, to my left here, Deputy Director for the Secretary of Defense Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations Cross-Functional Team, Ms. Vernita Harris. Vernita is the Director for Electromagnetic Spectrum Enterprise Policies and Programs at the DoD CIO Office. Mr. David Tremper, Director of Electronic Warfare, or EW, supporting the platforms and weapons portfolio management, P and WPMP, OUSD, ANS, and Mr. Brian Herman, Director Cybersecurity and Analytics here at DISA. The panel discussion will focus on highlighting how the Joint Staff, DoD, CIO, OUSD, and DISA support developing and delivering solutions to today's electromagnetic spectrum operational challenges, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that. So real quick, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit and then give each of the panelists 5 minutes just to discuss their particular area. So I'm as I said, I'm the director of the Defense Spectrum Organization. When I first got in, we had to figure out why DSO. And the why we figured out is, as kind of my statement here, is to empower and enable people to solve tomorrow's spectrum challenges today. And that's what we try to do on a daily basis. My mission is to provide tools, capabilities, and expertise to empower DoD to solve tomorrow's spectrum challenges today. So that's the mission of my organization. And my vision is that the commander, no matter who that commander is, JTF, Combatant Command, Coalition Commander, has freedom of action within the electromagnetic spectrum where and when needed at any time. The electromagnetic spectrum goes across all domains of warfighting, okay? So we know when the commander wants to make a decision, he wants to be able to say, execute, 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 and the path is going to be there to either get that ordnance on target or just get the communications through, right? So that's what the whole purpose of taking advantage of the electromagnetic spectrum across all domains. So the big focus for me right now, my really top priority, is developing the electromagnetic battle management tool. Okay, so electromagnetic battle management tool is what we're developing for the Combatant Command and JTF commanders to use for the commanders to make swift decisions that they can fight through the electromagnetic spectrum without interference and without having any problems getting the communications or ordnance on target. So that's the whole purpose of EMBM. EMBM, again, is to facilitate operations more than anything else. And it cuts across all the domains. Mr. Trumper and I were talking earlier about trying to make sure it is helping with ISR in the future. It is a developmental process. The intent right now is for electromagnetic battle management to achieve initial operating capability in September timeframe. And then the final operational capability is set for fiscal year 24. So it's a developmental process. So we're going to keep developing the tool and make it better for the commander to use as we go forward. And so that's the primary focus of what I'm doing right now in the Defense Spectrum Organization as far as this panel is concerned. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand it to each of the panelist members for them to give brief comments, and then we'll go through the question and answer session. So I'll start with Brigadier General Lala. Thanks, Darren.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to set the stage today for the rest of the panelists here, describing the problem. Why are we talking about this today? For the last 20 or 30 years, the U.S. military has enjoyed freedom of action in the electromagnetic spectrum at the time, place, and parameters of our choosing. With the reemergence of near-peer competitors, we do not have that luxury. We have to fight for and win the electromagnetic spectrum when we want to use it. Number one, we use the spectrum for so many different purposes. We use it to target, to track, to communicate, to see, to sense, to assess, to share data links for many different purposes. I was at the AFA conference in the fall, and General Mark Kelly, Commander of Air Combat Commands, one of the quotes he said is, if we lose the war in the EMS, we lose the war in the air, and we lose it quickly. So that kind of sets, I think that can be applied to any domain. The U.S. military and others have, in modern warfare, have lots of capabilities that we use in the electromagnetic spectrum and depend on them. In FY19, in the NDAA, Congress directed the Secretary of Defense to establish electromagnetic spectrum operations cross-functional team, and also to designate a senior official to oversee that operation. In February of 19, then Secretary Shanahan designated the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the senior designated official. He also established the EMSO CFT. One other key happening shortly thereafter, in May of 2020, the Joint Staff published 3-85, which is Joint Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations, which brought together what was in the past disparate areas: electromagnetic warfare, EW, and spectrum management. So we're looking at these things holistically. So EMSO, electromagnetic spectrum operations, that is to coordinated military actions to exploit, attack, protect, and manage the electromagnetic environment. In the fall of 2020, the EMSO CFT coordinated, worked with DoD CIO to publish the DoD EMS Superiority Strategy. It was signed by Secretary Esper in October of 2020. The strategy has 5 goals roughly centered around capabilities, infrastructure, readiness, partnerships, and governance within the electromagnetic spectrum. Immediately after it was signed, the CFT began developing an implementation plan. Think of it as a decomposition of those 5 goals and 18 objectives underneath the strategy. So how do we accomplish the strategy? The vision of the strategy is freedom of action in the electromagnetic spectrum. Being able to do all those capabilities that I talked about a little bit earlier when we want to, when we need to, and deny those to our adversaries. In October of 2020, the EMSO CFT transitioned oversight and of the execution of the strategy and implementation plan to DoD CIO for the long term. And the department has been reorienting, and I'm sure Mrs. Harris is going to talk more about this, about reorienting on executing that strategy. One last thing I'll say before I'll hand it over to my colleague, Mrs. Harris, is I wanted to talk, we don't have US Stratcom here, but at the operational level, so what I just described to you was at the strategic level. At the operational level, US Stratcom has the Unified Command Plan authorities, UCP authorities, to lead the EMSO efforts. And they are standing up a joint EMSO center, which is a 2-star direct reporting organization under Commander US Stratcom, to lead EMSO efforts at the combatant command level. That involves the people. They are standing up GEMSOCs at each of the combatant commands, the Joint Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations cells. Think of those as the people that will help the combatant commanders integrate EMSO operations into their plans, their operations, bring visualization to what is going on. General Skinner talked about it a little bit earlier at the keynote. He talked about battle space visualization and seamless transport. Those are some of the things that those GEMSOCs will be doing. Mr. Argo talked about you can read 3 different elements of what the GEMSOCs are doing. The people, the tool, which is the electromagnetic battle management system, which will provide visualization. Where are the emitters? What's going on in the electromagnetic spectrum? What are they doing? Which ones are friendly? Which ones are not? And then the data. The sensors providing the data that allow us to understand what the electromagnetic operating environment is, what is happening in the electromagnetic operating environment. So those are my initial thoughts and comments, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Mrs. Harris.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you very much. And as Darren indicated, I am very thankful for the CFT. They have, you can't hear me? No. Let's see. Is that better?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm thankful for the CFT, and we are all thankful for what the CFT has done. And as you said, that has transitioned the work that the CFT was doing on the electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy. What we call in our office, our Dr. Fletcher, our principal deputy CIO, has coined it EMS3. And so it's kind of shortened, and it's kind of, have a mouthful. So I'm very thankful for that. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to AFCEA and to AFCEA for hosting this event. And thank you to my fellow panelists, not just for sharing the stage today, but for the partnership we are forging on a daily basis. I'm Vernita D. Harris, as Chris indicated, and I'm the director of the Electromagnetic Spectrum Enterprise Policy and Programs Office within the DoD CIO. Our office is responsible for the electromagnetic spectrum strategy, EMS3, and governance of the DoD EMS enterprise. Short for Spectrum. We leverage a team of diverse cross-functional experts to navigate an increasingly complex global landscape in pursuit of the Department's spectrum interests across the executive and legislative branches, the international community, and industry. Many on this stage know that my affinity for Star Trek, but for today, and for Star Trek and for science fiction, but today I'm going to focus on something most of you are well known, Star Wars. That's my other favorite as well. From the Star Wars canon, we must acknowledge we cannot overcome our spectrum challenges alone. Digital technologies are changing the world. They're changing the Department of Defense, and as we move from an industrial age to an information age, we must modernize our digital environment across the department. We must recognize now more than ever the importance of collaboration with our industry and academic partners and other stakeholders. At the conclusion of Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, Luke Skywalker asked Han Solo to help rebels attack the Death Star. As you know, Solo was skeptical, very skeptical, and he declines, not wanting to get involved, and the battle commences without him. Well, after rebel forces suffer considerable casualties, the situation looks bleak. Darth Vader, that he just zooms in, he zooms in and on Luke's fighter and utters, "I have you now." At that very dramatic moment, in his Millennium Falcon, laser cannons blazing, ultimately, Luke's life is saved by Han Solo. This gives Luke enough space and time to hit that 1 in a million shot, and resulting in the destruction of the Death Star. So, moving on, in Return of the Jedi, Skywalker was at Yoda's side when he died, at the ripe age of 900 years old. Luke leaves Yoda's hut. He walked over to his X-Wing fighter, and you see RT-D2 making repairs, and he goes, "I can't do it. I cannot do it, R2. I cannot do this alone." And lo and behold, what happens? Obi-Wan Kenobi appears and declares, "Yoda and I will always be with you." There are many leaderships and collaboration lessons to be learned from Star Wars. With the EMS-3, we have formed a governance structure that leverages talents and stakeholders from across the DoD and plugs into existing bodies so that we may deliver spectrum required for JADC2 and the warfighter. But even with these strides, we recognize the Department of Defense and the U.S. government cannot solve our spectrum challenges by ourselves. Instead, we rely on a diverse constellation of partners. We need industry to provide renegades who support the warfighter, like Han Solo, who are willing to think differently, take risks, fall quickly, and learn from those failures. We need coherent and comprehensive plans and investments which provide clear direction. We need to establish and maintain a strong national technology and industrial base, which produces a skilled workforce, creates domestic manufacturing capacity, and limits dependence on global supply chains. Fostering these public-private infrastructure partnerships combine diverse perspectives, authorities, and capabilities. Like Han's relationship and partnership with Chewbacca, the Wookiee, we need to rely on our friends and allies from other cultures. Places. U.S. military operations are seldom unilateral and increasingly rely on contributions from our allies and partners. We need to remove barriers limiting collaboration and require interoperable data sources and architectures. In coordination with our international partners, we must negotiate agreements, focus on establishing coalitions, the use of their full portfolio of spectrum capabilities, pursuing coalition partnerships for interoperability will ensure future maneuver in the spectrum is not limited by non-U.S. capability. Finally, we need the wisdom of Yoda-like scientists and academics. Across the board, the government is increasing investment in research between industry, academia, and federal laboratories. These initiatives aim to gather resources, wisdom, and experience from diverse sources to tackle the nation's most pressing challenges. Within NCEP, we have reorganized our office so that it aligns with the 5 goals in the EMS3 strategy. We have initiatives underway in support of all of the above, perhaps some of which I will speak during the Q&A portion of the panel. But to return to my strategic theme, as Secretary Austin said in his Day 1 message to the force, none of us succeeds at this business alone. Defending the country requires teamwork and cooperation. We need to remember this now more than ever. We are stronger together. Thank you again to all, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, and can you hear me? I think I got to work the mic. All right, thank you, Vernita. So I'm Dave Trepper. I'm the Director of Electronic Warfare in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. Can you hear me in the back? You can, kinda. Let me use this one here. All right, can you hear me now? I think everybody will hear me now. Okay. So I'm Director of Electronic Warfare, Office of Secretary of Defense, Acquisition and Sustainment. It's actually now in the department called Electromagnetic Warfare, right? So that change in definition really encapsulates now that we have directed energy, lasers, HPMs are part of the electromagnetic warfare portfolio. So as the Director of Electromagnetic Warfare, right, my job is to oversee the health and status of the U.S. Department of Defense capabilities in detection of signals in the environment, countering systems electromagnetically in the environment, as well as protecting sensors in the environment. And that last one is really an interesting one to peel apart. So if you look up on Wikipedia, right, you'll see electronic warfare defined as electronic attack, electronic support, electronic protection. Well, in the Department of Defense, we build electronic attack and electronic support systems. And so they are easily managed as programs within a portfolio. Electronic protect is a feature that spectrum using systems insert, right? So radios, radars, PNT systems, they have electronic protect features. Those are not part of my portfolio, right? So as the electromagnetic warfare director, I don't oversee how those systems achieve EMS survivability through their EP features. And really, that creates kind of cylinders of excellence within the department on how we pursue electromagnetic spectrum systems. Right? We have radio programs, we have PNT programs, radar programs, electronic warfare programs, but historically there has not been a body that looks across those different stovepipes and says, are you doing electromagnetic survivability right? Right? And when you deliver systems to the operator, there's really two important attributes of those systems, capability and survivability. A lot of attention is paid to capability. Survivability, while sometimes it's planned, it is often cut because budgets get constrained and they have to find money to achieve capability, which is really where the requirements on the systems lie. Right, so over the past couple of years, we have been pressing hard to focus on EMS survivability. Right? And with General Allah and Vernita working between the CFT and the CIO, we have collectively been drawing the department's attention to the EMS survivability in our spectrum using systems and the importance of that attribute, and that it should not be overlooked or made an afterthought. Because I think most of us know who have built EMS systems, you can't go back after the fact and make it survivable. Right? You have to bake it in from the beginning, because that survivability has an impact on both your capability and your cost. And there's trades that have to be made, and you have to make those trades in the design phase, and then you have to exercise that survivability later. So one of the approaches that we've been taking within a department electromagnetic warfare community is effectively to create an iron sharpens iron approach to how we achieve EMS survivability, taking our EW systems and exercising them against our EMS using systems, so that we can highlight where capability exists, where vulnerabilities exist, and then we can go back and help make the fixes on those different systems. So it's not ironic that I should be sitting in the position of Director of EW for Acquisition. I came up through science and technology, right? So I came up through the Navy S&T community. I started as a ship missile defense guy, right? Then I migrated on. I was doing counter IED, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but I was countering radio-controlled IEDs for the Department of Defense. And then that spread out to EW system development, submarines and tactical aircraft and helicopters and just about everything. And so when you have that broad swath of view on how different communities build your EW systems, you realize that it's very similar. Right? The hardware and the software is very similar across all those different users, despite the fact that you may be using it for a submarine at periscope depth over here or a ground vehicle over there. Those domains might not realize how similar their problems are. But when you come at it from a spectrum using or spectrum technologist perspective, you realize there's commonalities there all over the place. I commented on counter IED because there was a revelation when the radio controlled IED showed up that we had a spectrum managing challenge. Right? So as soon as the IED jammers showed up out in the field, they were jamming comms. Who's using comms? Well, we were using comms, right? So suddenly we have a comms problem. So now we have this spectrum deconfliction challenge. The communicators of the world say, EW, you got to go fix this because we were here first and we were working just fine until you showed up with your jammers. Right? So the EW community starts adjusting their transmitters so that they are not stomping on radio signals. And lo and behold, what do we discover? That doesn't actually work. Right? So what we find out is that there's RF phenomenology happening that you can't plan for when you do spectrum allocation. Right? It's not as simple as drawing lines on a chart and saying you get this portion of the band and you get this portion of the band and everybody's going to play nicely. And I think we realized that as a country. We saw it in the 5G radar altimeter interference issue that showed up. That RITCA report came out in October of 2020. Suddenly the 5G community in January, or the FCC in January says, I think actually it was the FAA in January says, you can't put those 5G transmitters out there because you're going to interfere with our radar altimeters. Right? From a spectrum allocation perspective, they were not operating in the same band. There was a guard band that existed between them. But then when you looked at the performance of the receivers on the radar altimeter, which were very high sensitivity receivers, and you looked at how vulnerable they were to detecting things outside the band, there was a recognition that signals, intentional or not, coming out of those 5G transmitters could have the potential for interfering with those radar altimeters, those legacy radar altimeters. So here is a case where pre-planned spectrum allocation becomes a problem. We need to be dynamic, we need to be agile in the way we use our spectrum. We need to understand that spectrum using systems can support a wide variety of applications, right? It doesn't need to be a radio developed for the purpose of operations on a submarine at periscope depth, right? It could be a radio that's software defined that allows agility. It could be a radio one day, it could be an EW system another day. But there's all of these opportunities with the way that we develop EMS using systems to be multifunction, to support multiple applications, to be programmable. And that programmable hardware and software modularity of our systems is becoming even more and more important. I think what we're realizing is that systems that are agile in the spectrum become very hard to predict what they're going to do. So our own systems that are detecting those and deriving countermeasures for those also have to be able to adapt very quickly on the fly. That acquisition is slow, is not lost on the acquisition community. The acquisition community is well aware that we have processes and bureaucracies in place that we need to break. The department is in the process of attempting to find those areas where we can break them and make things go faster. And I think we'll be talking about that a little bit later, but I'll point out the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, which is an attempt within the Office of Undersecretary of Acquisition to enable streamlined acquisition. It's not perfect. It's a start. It's an attempt to say, can we acquire systems in different ways depending on how mature they are? What type of, are they a software capability? Are they a hardware capability? And actually accelerate capability of the warfighter so that we're not behind the curve on acquisition, and systems that you could achieve capability through a software drop actually allow you to deliver capability through a software drop, right? And so the department is paying close attention across EMS using systems, particularly in my portfolio of electromagnetic warfare systems, to understand how do we deliver and monitor and upgrade capability that way. Thank you.
Let's see if this will work. Sounds like this.
Let's hand off.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Brian Herman, and unlike everybody else at the table, I'm not a spectrum guy. And so, you'll go, well, why are we going to listen to him? I'll promise to be brief. I like what was said here because I think it sets the stage for the challenge that we're facing right now. And that is, it couldn't be a more challenging time to have near-peer competition going on. And that means that we do have to worry about freedom of action. And so in the space that I spend my time in, at least in part, is JADC2. And so JADC2 is all about making sure that we can get information to decision makers so that we can take action faster than our adversaries. And that's a very generic way to say that. Historically, we've called it some other things, but the OODA loop or what have you. But when you look at DISA's role, and I think maybe now we're getting to check. Yeah. This one will shut up. So, can you still hear me okay? Okay. So, when you look at DISA's role in JADC2, we have a number of them. But every single use case, when you imagine getting sensor data to a decision maker, involves spectrum. Sometimes it's the tactical piece of connecting the sensor to the network, and sometimes it's long-haul communications that relies on that as well. But again, we can't depend upon having full ownership of that spectrum. And so we have an interconnectedness with our allies and coalition partners, as well as with industry. So in this space, we have to think ahead of time. We have to think in terms of the acquisition timeline as well as the operational timeline. And so I would suggest that things like EMBM, battle management for the electronic spectrum, actually is one of those key capabilities that ought to be on the JADC2 radar, and perhaps isn't yet, because they're happy to look at new visualization tools for other more easily visualized operational mediums like air, land, sea, space. But spectrum is sort of nebulous and it's hard to figure out. And so it's not the great visualization demonstration that you would like to see in those typical JADC2 meetings that we have. The other piece of this is, like I said before, we have to work with allied and coalition partners, and our desire is to play away games in this space, and that means that we again have less control. But we are interdependent in providing these capabilities. Everything that we do in JADC2 relies upon spectrum, and it's getting tougher and tougher, and it needs to be more well thought out ahead of time. The capabilities that we put in place have to have the ability to flex towards the needs of whatever theater that we're going to be in as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me all right? Okay, we're going to fight through this mic thing, no matter what. Okay, so Dave, I got to follow up. I'm just having a conversation here, but so in Baghdad in 2004, I was the first guy to get the jammers for the 1st Armored Division, and I was the first guy to lose communications to the jammers, just so you know. But again, he also talked about adaptive acquisition framework, and that's what we're using to field EMBM. So we're completely taking advantage of it, and it is working out, what's the operational term, swimmingly. That's probably the best way to put it, but it is going extremely well. And like I said, we intend to be IOC in September.
Come on.
So right now I've got some questions. I'm going to go through for the panel members, and we'll go forward from there. So first I want to start with General Lala, and I want to step back and take a big picture view for a moment. The 2020 C3 modernization strategy states, EMS transcends all warfighting domains, enables mission execution within each. Given that statement, and in light of what we are seeing in Europe right now, how important is EMS superiority for the U.S. and all of its allies? That would seem true.
This one works. Okay. Yeah. So I would say the electromagnetic spectrum is foundational. It is the physical layer that we operate in. So anything that you do in cyber or in either in garrison or if you're in an expeditionary environment is using the electromagnetic spectrum. Either you're in a conductor, maybe in copper or fiber, or you're in free space. Everybody has a cell phone in this audience, so everybody uses it, but how many think about what is actually happening? You're communicating on a cell tower that then is connected to the network and then is then sending your voice around the world. That can be denied. And all the other purposes that we use the electromagnetic spectrum for. I talked a little bit about this at the beginning, targeting, tracking, communicating, data links, sharing, assessing, sensing. All those things use the electromagnetic spectrum, and so it is really critical to ensure that our warfighters can have to use the electromagnetic spectrum for the purposes that I just described when they need to, and then to deny that to our adversaries when we need to. We can't assume it. We can't assume we're going to have it because it can, in near-peer competition, it can be denied to us, and our systems really rely on it.
Thanks, Darren. Appreciate it. Okay, next I was going to ask Mr. Trumper a question. Rapid acquisition of innovative electromagnetic spectrum capabilities will be critical to achieving electromagnetic superiority. How is ANS helping to ensure DoD achieves EMS Superiority from a capability management portfolio standpoint.
Is that one? Can you hear me now? Oh, you can hear me now. Okay. Well, okay. So I pointed out earlier the adaptive acquisition framework. Again, it's not perfect, right? But it's an attempt to understand what's the maturity of the underlying technology that's delivering the system that you're trying to acquire. Right? So within that adaptive acquisition framework, you'll see things like rapid prototyping, rapid fielding, software acquisition, right? And there's timelines associated with those that enable you to have equipment. If there's a prototype that exists, you can go through a rapid fielding process that allows you to essentially jump part of that the acquisition process to get to the point where I have a capability. Now it's a matter of fielding it. If I've got a mature technology, I can jump in at the rapid prototyping. Right? There's a wide variety of access points that allow you to get in and get through the acquisition process in a more streamlined way than you would with what's called JSIDs. So if you're familiar with JSIDs, JSIDs is really the acquisition and requirements Bible for the way we get systems, right? And so JSIDs points out, these are all the requirements you have to address, these are all the check boxes you have to check, right? You have to do all these things along the way, and you have to provide your plans, and how are you going to meet these things? And that churn of documentation, that churn of process imparts time on the way that we acquire systems. But every little checkbox in that JSIDs process is there for a reason. So there's a tough balance between how do you manage risk and how do you get things fast, right? And so the JSIDs process is there essentially to tamp down risk to the point that it's not there anymore, right? It is a risk management process. The adaptive acquisition framework is attempting to say, okay, I've got this risk management process. Is there a way that I can streamline the delivery of the capability and accept some risk? Right? And what's the balance of that risk that I'm willing to accept? Well, one of the balances of that risk is a lot of the requirements that you see in the JSIDs that say you must meet these requirements are not in the adaptive acquisition framework. You can essentially accelerate past some of those requirement checkboxes. That's a risk, right? There's an acceptance of risk in going through that process. Now, the catch to this is the adaptive acquisition process at the end has to reinsert itself into JSIDs, but towards the end of the JSIDs process. It's kind of a confusing parallel world. Adaptive acquisition allows you to accelerate past a lot of the upfront JSIDs process, but then towards the end, you have to reinsert the program into JSIDs. So at the end of the day, there is theoretically a check on all of these JSIDs requirements that you just sidestepped through the adaptive acquisition framework. So there is a challenge ahead in how do we meet all of these requirements while doing it quickly and while attempting to sidestep a lot of the requirements that are in the JSIDs process for a reason. It's very complicated, right? I just tried to gloss over it and give you this parallel world vision of how adaptive acquisition and JSIDs work and are compatible. But again, adaptive acquisition is relatively new. Right? It is evolving as it goes. As Chris pointed out, they have a middle tier acquisition program in EMBM that's attempting to accelerate the capability to deliver the capability quickly to the warfighter and allow essentially a build while fly system. Right? So I deliver a baseline capability, and then I can spiral upgrade that capability in the field while operators are using it. So I think you'll see within the acquisition portfolio a number of programs that are taking that approach to a build while fly, deliver a baseline capability, get the operators something they can use quickly, and then have the program of record doing the spiral upgrades through the modularity of that system in the field.
Thanks, Dave. Can you hear me? Okay. Part of the adaptive acquisition framework that we're using, we can actually get user feedback when we go to the next step in the process, which has been instrumental in our getting this out to the field in the hands of the operator that they wanted. Okay, next I have Dr. Herman. Question for Dr. Herman. As DoD focuses on making better decisions at the speed of relevance, how important is leveraging the standard automation interface to enabling cloud-based and artificial intelligence technologies to deliver joint enterprise capabilities that facilitate dynamic EMS access and maneuver for DoD operations. That's a mouthful, I know. So.
It is. So one of the observations that I would make is that we can't people our way out of the problems that we have today. And so automation is absolutely essential in all of the aspects of what we're doing for JADC2 as well as electromagnetic spectrum. So I used a couple of use cases before where we talked about the ability to get information to commanders. In many cases, frankly, in most cases, what we would really like to do is to be able to automate the response and then just acknowledge what needs to be done so that we can respond much more quickly than we could if we had to do manual analysis. I've said a number of times that DoD is drowning in data. Data is not the problem that we have. It's turning that data into actionable information that we can then take some actions. Ideally, those actions would be automated and not just a manual review. It's the same problem that we have in cybersecurity. It's the same problem that we have to have in terms of active management of our transport network, of our sensors, and you can extend that to weapon systems that would be used to take action as well. That's the logical next step of the capabilities that we're trying to build in JADC2.
All right, thanks very much. Of course, eliminating the man in the loop is key to everything we are all doing here. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Harris, we've all talked about the importance of electromagnetic superiority strategy as the organization most central to EMS superiority strategy's success. Could you please discuss your progress with regard to the importance and most important aspects in implementing this strategy?
Thank you, Chris. Yes, so last year when the strategy, the EMS3, was transitioned over to the DoD CIO's office, one of the things we looked across and looked at our structure and realized that the structure that what's currently present within the Spectrum office wasn't fit for purpose for executing on the EMS3. And so one of the things that we did was we organized the strategy so that there were 5 strategic goals across in our office and that align with the EMS3. And those deputy directors, we've started hiring, and we're at the GS15 level. So it was also important that not only that the department as well as external stakeholders see that we are putting teeth into this and really looking to have this strategy be successful. We have a deputy director that's for every strategic goal, from the capabilities to, that's goal 1. Goal 2 is you're looking at data and architecture and IT modernization. And in goal 3, we're looking at our workforce and workforce readiness. And goal 4, we're looking at the partnerships and engagement. And then the biggest one was with the GAO recognizes that governance. How are we going to governance? And so we established a governance strategic goal as well. And so what we've been doing in the last 6 months, we have had roundtables with Dr. Hicks. We had a roundtable to look at how we're sharing 5G spectrum, and we had a number of C-suite executives come to that roundtable. Earlier this month, we had a roundtable on capabilities, and we talked about what are those capabilities that we need to develop for the warfighter, because at the end of the day, that's the most important job that we have, is to make sure that what are the policies that we're putting in place support our warfighter. Then we are also hosting something DoD has never done before. We created a partnership for advancing trust and holistic spectrum solutions. That group is working with the private sector. It's working with private sector, academics, and other stakeholders that use spectrum to look at developing some use cases that we could use as we start to look at sharing spectrum. And so I would say that endeavors are going well. I mean, the motto in our office is transparency and collaboration, not just internally, but also externally. And that's how I think that we get to change. Thanks.
Thanks very much. We're going to go ahead back to the Spectrum Operations community, ask General Lola. The EMSO cross-functional team led the development and staffing of EMS security strategy, or EMS 3, which is what we're calling it now, that the Secretary signed in October of 2020. You noted in your remarks that the Secretary signed the strategy implementation plan last year. One of the key impacts of those efforts was working to synchronize capability development and interoperability across Spectrum operations communities, such as coalition, attack, operations, and protect, within a joint maneuver space. Can you elaborate on the impact of the Department of the Warfighter in bringing those communities together? How are these activities transitioning to support JADC2, and what are the challenges does the Department face on moving these forward?
Okay. All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, great question. What Mrs. Harris described, the governance structure, is kind of the top level, the key piece of how we're going to bring the strategy to fruition. Those 5 goals that we talked about, each one of them has a series of tasks that were identified in the implementation plan. And those teams that Mrs. Harris described, those 5 teams that DoD CIO is leading, are ensuring that those tasks are being accomplished. Those tasks have primary reporting responsibilities throughout the department. As you can imagine, something like the electromagnetic spectrum touches components across the department. So it really is a whole of department effort in accomplishing this strategy. I wanted to echo some of the technology needed since we have a lot of our industry partners here today. Echo some of the things. I know Mr. Tremper mentioned several things already as to what technologies do we need. Wouldn't it be cool if, as General Skinner said, we had these and are able to bring these to fruition? But Mrs. Harris also mentioned dynamic spectrum access and sharing. That is key. When I was, my background is communications engineering. We used to have single channel radios, that is not the way of the future. We need to be agile within the spectrum. We need to be able to observe the spectrum, see what's going on there, and be able to move within the spectrum. Think of it as a maneuver space. As you kind of think of it in other domains, it's a maneuver space. We also need to think of it in a multifunction way. Mr. Tremper mentioned in different contexts, systems can operate in different ways using the electromagnetic spectrum. In one sense, it could be using communications. In another, it could be sensing. In another, it could be attacking, let's say. So having multifunction systems as opposed to exquisite, big, expensive platforms that are difficult to upgrade, we need to move away from that context. We need to be able to minimize our EMS footprint. If you can be targeted, you put yourself at risk. So being able to minimize our EMS footprint to reduce detection and reduce targeting. Resiliency in RF-enabled cyber attacks. We need that capability. Modular open system architectures. We need that capability. Software-defined systems that are more platform agnostic. We need those capabilities. Modeling and simulation of realistic electromagnetic operating environments. Mr. Tremper mentioned the difficulty of understanding what is going on with respect to a particular system operating in a band. He described a system that had a band that was operating even with a guard band. But what is actually going on so that you can model it and understand the effects that it might have on other systems. I like to think of it as we need to move towards a fires and maneuvers approach. Kind of the way you think about it in a domain, fires and maneuvers, we need to do the same thing in the electromagnetic spectrum. We need the electromagnetic battle management system. You know, I mean, situational awareness, understanding what is going on in the electromagnetic spectrum is the first step. You need to understand what's going on so that you can make good decisions. Commanders can know what portion of the spectrum they can use and operate in. We need to have speed in our systems, being able to adapt quickly to a changing operating environment. And this goes to a little bit to the cognitive electromagnetic warfare systems. And Mr. Tremper already talked a little bit about the adaptive acquisition framework that'll help us to bring these systems to the warfighters quicker. So that's what I'd say on that one.
Thanks, Darren. Appreciate it. Okay, next, Bernita, I understand you and the DoD CIO team have done a great deal of work to integrate EMS governance into existing processes to support the warfighter and JADC2. Could you please expound upon this?
Thank you, Chris. We have. So as Darren indicated, we rechartered the Electromagnetic Spectrum Senior Steering Group, which is a steering group that moves its way up through the DoD, DoD, CIO, C3LB, overarching governance board. And the significance of that is that what's coming out of the EMSSG is going across the department, and decisions are being made that are coming from the strategy and from the I plan, and they're moving up so that you could have a decision point if you need advocacy for not just from the DoD CIO. We also have the ability to go up to DMAG, the tank, and the JROC. But what's also significant about that is we have a direct line to the EWXCOM, and that is a big part of the strategy of electronic warfare and the electronic attack, the electronic protection, and those issues that Mr. David talked about. And so being able to discuss problematic issues and have them discussed across the department and have everyone involved and say, this is the right issue that we need to start taking up to our senior leadership to get advocacy for, especially during this palm season. That has been the most, while it's been a challenging issue, it has been really rewarding because we can see that the collaboration is happening. I would also just point out that Darren talked about spectrum. Spectrum is extremely important. David talked about spectrum. We need to start thinking about spectrum as a strategic asset, not just frequencies hopping, but that how are we using spectrum? And then if we can start thinking about spectrum as a strategic asset, and then start to look at not our national spectrum strategy that's being developed by NTIA, is that process, how is it working to make sure that our warfighter is getting the tools and the capabilities that they need? So it's not just frequency, it's not just spectrum, it's also the regulatory and the policy issues that behind it, and how that we make sure that when our regulators are putting these policies in place into a national strategy, it makes that we're protecting our warfighter and making sure that we're able to move in that maneuver space. Thanks.
Okay, super. Thanks very much. Okay, last question is just going to be for Dr. Herman. That's how is DISA integrating the EMS into enterprise capabilities for JADC2?
So I can be quick on that one. So it is one of our key contributions of DISA's portion of JADC2. As I mentioned, I think it should be one of the flagship capabilities to treat spectrum like that asset that we need it to be as we fight forward. So the other capabilities that we provide in DISA, transport, which I mentioned, already include spectrum, but we also provide the common operational picture and several other command and control planning tools. Those planning tools, that common operational picture needs to have a spectrum overlay so that we understand what we're up against in all of those planning scenarios and planning and operational execution scenarios.
All righty. Well, that's it. Thanks for answering the questions. Darren, I really appreciate you saying what the commander said. If we lose the battle on EMS, we lose it across the board. So very fruitful thought there. So what I'll do now is just open the floor to any questions. If you could move to the microphone and ask the question to any of the panel members, I'd appreciate it. Over. No.
Great panel, really important missionary. A follow-up question, really for Dave Tremper, but for anybody on the panel. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great panel. I'd like to follow up on an example that Dave Tremper brought up, but it really touches upon each of your areas, particularly spectrum as a national and defense asset arena. Dave, you brought up a great example with radar altimeters, and you described the radar altimeters as having very sensitive receivers. I would opine that they were sloppily built receivers without efficient filters. And it's not uncommon on the receiver side for years to have built less than elegant solutions because we had the opportunity to be sloppy with guardband. And the problem is particularly significant with DoD systems because we deploy them in areas where, of course, we're going to own the spectrum environment. But what we're seeing as spectrum is more of a recognized strategic asset, that the filters that were good enough 20 years ago aren't good enough now. And I'm just wondering if you've looked at, or you are looking at, maybe something like a spectrum tax on legacy systems, that if you built it 20 or 30 years ago and you built it with really sloppy filtering for receivers, that increasingly, as we fail to replace and renew those systems, we're essentially paying a silent tax on spectrum resources because we now have to protect that guardband. Would it be useful to go back through our legacy systems and create a pre-planned upgrade to recover the spectrum? We saw the same thing in GPS, where smartphones actually have much better filtering around GPS than many of the DoD weapon systems do, because smartphones had to. Just a comment on the utility of generating a cost for legacy programs for being wasteful in spectrum.
So that, can you hear me? No, it's like musical microphones. Okay, so possibly, right? But I will point out that it's not just old sloppy receivers, old sloppy transmitters are a problem too, right? And so anybody who's built an EMS system, you overdrive a power amplifier, you end up with spurs. Spurs cause problems, right? And they particularly cause problems when they are near high sensitivity receivers, right? Imagine a ground vehicle that's got radios on it, it's got a high sensitivity EW receiver on it. Tactical radios are putting out spurs right below the noise floor that they are using, but above the noise floor that the receivers are using. So the answer is yes. Possibly, how do you tax these legacy systems to deal with linearity, right? To be better linear systems. I don't think there's specifically an effort going on to do that. However, I will point out that we're even challenged in our ability to go to very dynamic spectrum using systems. And it's not just the technology side, it's actually not the side. It's really the testing and how do you exercise those things. And I had talked to Motorola about this, and Motorola was pointing out they had a dynamic spread spectrum system that was using multiple gigahertz of bandwidth, operational bandwidth, to achieve robust comms. When they attempted to test that, what they were pigeonholed into was 50 megahertz worth of bandwidth they could use for testing. Right? So even if you get a very agile system that could potentially be very cognitive and adaptive in the way it uses the spectrum, the process that we use for exercising and testing those needs to change and evolve as well. Right? So while yes, here's the band that you stay in, we're going to tax you if you get outside the band, could be useful for making sure that they are good, obedient, pure spectrum users. We've also got this problem that even if you are a very agile system, and you can operate across a wide variety of spectrum, and you're spectrally pure at any given time within that spectrum, we really are challenged in our ability to accommodate that level of adaptability, because the infrastructure assumes that you're going to stay within your bounds, right? So while yes, legacy systems, be pure, we're going to come after you, we also have to think about those systems that are very dynamic, who could potentially maneuver around the different bands, and how do we accommodate those types of things.
Great. There's spectrum gold in them mills.
Yeah.
And I would also add that we also need to take a look at our regulatory structure, and is our spectrum management system in the U.S. fit for the 21st century? That's something I do would think we need to look at, because if we can't test how we train because of a regulatory system, we need to change that, because we're moving from this more we're moving from manufacturing, industrial, to more this information age, and I don't think our laws and rules are catching up. So that I also think that's something that we should be looking at as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. The FCC just opened the Greater Electrical Receiver proceeding at this point, and they don't have significant facilities to do the agile type test emissions survival. So it really does take DOD into thank you.
Howdy. Many of the stories were told here very near to me, because 18 years ago I was at E4 flipping on the dude in the Humvee, and then all of a sudden legal track wasn't over there. So definitely understand the stories. I actually have a couple questions. First question is, with regard to policy, so I come from Stratcom and Lucas at the house, doing the FCC, is and part of the reason I buy is because there's not a lot of programs that can do this space. So, one of my questions is from a policy perspective, as we open up the spectrum in order to get commercial partners in, that will then innovate and hopefully continue to innovate in that space. Obviously, we have to deal with there are now more players in the spectrum. How is this office attempting to handle that now?
Thank you. I believe your question is, how are we dealing with, as we open up spectrum, how are we dealing with spectrum sharing? Right. Yep. So that's a good question. So last November, Congress passed a law, the Jobs and Investment, we call it Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. And in that bill, there was a Section 9008 for DOD to look at 3.1 to 3.45, which was huge, because that's the sweet spot for 5G commercial wireless spectrum. And we are starting to look at that. We've already maintained we can't vacate, we can't suppress. And so what does that look like? And so working with industry, working with our national regulators, we're starting to develop sharing use cases that would allow DoD and the commercial 5G wireless to work together in that band, to share that band. Is it challenging? Absolutely. Are we there yet? Not yet, but we're getting there. And I do think that if we were to just go at it alone, it would not be a success. And so I am very proud of the team that we have put together, and I'm really excited that DoD took a chance, and because this is the first time that we are doing this type of sharing framework, where we're working to share classified information with the select few, with the appropriate caveats. But we've seen some really good work come out of that.
My next question, really for so I'm actually on the cyber side of the house in Stratcom. So cybersecurity like survivability generally gets cut for capability. How is your office holding this potential office, account for that?
So I'm not sure I'm holding them in terms of policy accountable for it, but what I can say is in my mind, cybersecurity is capable. The ability to defend our networks against our adversaries is essential now more than ever. We build that capability in. So as you look, some speaking a few moments ago about Vendome. That's our instantiation of zero trust. The piece that's probably least well defined and explained is that ability to automate the response actions that are necessary when we start operating in a much more automated space. So we automate transport, we automate cybersecurity decision making. If I walk around the floor here, I'll find vendors that can tell me that they can automate up to 85% of the response actions that we have. And I'm not sure if we're there yet, but I think that we have the ability to do much better than we do today, not only for cost, but because the threat is so fast, we can't respond to it in the same way we have historically.
You know, I'll add a point to that from the acquisition perspective. So I mentioned JSIDS before and the associated process that has to go through. If you Google JSIDS 2018, you can find the entire manual on how requirements and acquisition works, right? And it's actually worth the read if you're trying to fall asleep. But at any rate, within that document now, you will find requirements of all acquisition systems that they have to address cyber survivability and EMS survivability as part of what's called a system survivability requirement. Right, so every acquisition program now has to do a self-assessment of their cyber and EMS vulnerabilities and then provide their plans for mitigating the risk for that, which includes inserting the capabilities. And then those insertions get tracked as part of the program. So it is being put in there. Now again, EMS survivability showed up in that context within JSIDS for the first time in 2018. Right, so only within the last 4 years. So acquisition is attempting to put those survivability requirements on it. But circle back to what I said earlier. Every one of those things that's in that JSIDS process is there for a reason, but they impart latency on acquisition. Right, so there's a delicate balance on how do you address all of these things, cyber survivability, EMS survivability, all your capabilities that you're trying to achieve and still get capability to the warfighter quickly.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Oh,
This will be the last one.
Good morning, Dave Wells from AT&T from the EMS group. On great panel this morning, a lot was said that's worth going back and thinking over. But I want to kind of draw attention to, there was a lot of talk about EMBM and the need for a holistic approach across all the EMS dependent systems of the Joint Force. So the Joint Force is capable of presenting, a consolidated, interoperable approach towards the adversary. And I guess my question is, it's great that we're going to have an operational level tool at the end of the year. But the real heart of this becomes when we get an automated overall capability of, dynamic EMBM, managing spectrum, doing real command and control of spectrum. And that's going to require all of the services who are developing tactical level tools to have that be interoperable with each other and with the operational level tools coming out of district. So just wondered if you would comment on how is that going, getting the services to conform with interoperable approaches, and specifically if you look at all the services, I want to kind of specifically call out space because the Space Force now, the space has been kind of treated as a separate thing for so long, having a Space Command, and the SDA, and now we've got a Space Force that should be consolidated with space acquisition. Are we going to see from the J8s, are we going to see specific requirements that create interoperability so space views space capabilities are almost always EMS capabilities, and their problems are almost always EMS problems. Are we going to see space get consolidated their requirements of the J8 or from Mr. Parent and Mr. Trevor, are we going to see more policies that bring those things together?
Okay, so quick to answer your question on the EMBM and working with the services, we are doing that. EMBM is pretty much based on the Army's Electromagnetic Warfare Planning Management tool. So those are very close, similar tools right now. So those should have a pretty good handshake. We're working closely with the Marines on their system to make sure it does a handshake as well, to ensure that we're not stepping on each other as well. And we're working with the Navy and the Air Force as well. Space is the next step. We have to explore that a little bit more. I don't have a lot of answers on space right now, so I don't know if anyone else. Go ahead.
I'd just like to just say a couple things about what you described is the complexity of the problem. You have the EMS, the electromagnetic spectrum, touches all of the services, all of our capabilities, and the joint force needs a collective and a synergistic a way to manage the spectrum in the future. What we've taken is this enterprise approach. We've taken an approach where it's methodical. It will not be solved overnight. We have a strategy. We have an implementation plan. The services are they were part of the EMSO CFT. The services are required in the implementation plan. They have tasks within the implementation plan. Those tasks are being held to account by the governance structure that Mrs. Harris's team leads and is ultimately accountable to the secretary. So there is a process put in place that will allow us to be ultimately successful. It won't happen, as I said, overnight because of the complexity of the problem and the legacy. I mean, highlighted the amount of legacy systems that we have to figure out what's the right balance between. We can't buy all new systems. If that would be great. But we have to understand what's the right balance between our legacy systems and the future operating concepts that we're trying to move towards. So.
Hello. I would just add, it is a complex problem, and I do think it's a question that we talk about daily in my office. How are we going to integrate the space? You have Space Command, you have Space Force, and the issues are complex. They're not just domestic issues; they're international issues. And then you also have the commercial space industry that's ramping up. And so I can tell you that we don't have a solution, but we are looking at it, and we're working together to find one. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I'll hand it back over to Marie. Thanks, everybody.
So, hey, thank you, everyone, for hanging in. I know we ran a couple minutes over, but thank you to Christopher Argo and the panel today on the Spectrum EMS discussion. I think it was very informative. So thank you for all your work, and thanks for attending today.